Hello everyone! Today we're going to talk about the missing couple. On May 15, 2013, a young couple mysteriously disappeared in a remote village in Shandong Province, China. A few days later, the police discovered their bodies in a natural cave within the forest. They were covered in injuries, and the wife was unrecognizable. Not only was she naked, but there were also severe signs of torture on her private parts. Even her pelvis, which is almost the hardest part of the human body, shuddered at the slightest touch. Just imagine how horrific the sexual assault she must have endured to cause such damage to her pelvis. Even the seasoned coroner, who had examined countless bodies, stated that this was the most brutal and inhumane act he had ever witnessed in his career. So, what exactly did this couple experience before their deaths? And why were they found in a cave in such a desolate wilderness? First, this couple had been married for half a year. They ran a small night market store together, and every night they would work late before heading home to rest. The next morning, they would go directly to the house of the husband's parents in a neighboring village for breakfast. However, on the morning of May 15, 2013, the mother-in-law had prepared breakfast as usual, but she waited and waited without seeing the couple arrive. She decided to call them to hurry them up, but both their phones were turned off. This was an unusual situation, as it had never happened before. The mother-in-law thought to herself, did they have a quarrel? But even if they argued, it didn't make sense that both of their phones would be unreachable. As a mother, the more she thought about it, the more worried and afraid she became. So she quickly rode her electric bike to her son's house. When she arrived, her uneasy feeling grew stronger. She noticed that the gate to the yard was left slightly ajar and she could push it open. Moreover, when she walked through the yard, the door to the house was also unlocked. She called out her son and daughter-in-law's names as she searched the house, but the living room and bedroom were empty and nothing seemed particularly unusual. However, when she returned to the yard, the sight that greeted her shocked her. The dog that the couple had raised was brutally killed and left in the corner of the yard. The walls and floor were covered in blood. The old woman was so terrified that her body went limp. She desperately tried to suppress her fear and immediately called the police. The local police arrived at the scene shortly, and after conducting a preliminary inspection of the house, they found that while the interior appeared relatively tidy at first glance, there were still many signs of abnormality. For example, there was a broken mop handle under the sofa, a snapped wooden stick next to the washing machine, and torn curtains, among other things. All these signs seemed to suggest that a violent struggle had occurred here. In addition, the most suspicious finding was that 2 surveillance cameras had been installed on the yard wall, but the wires to the cameras had been completely cut. At the same time, the computer tower in the house was also missing. Experienced investigators immediately recognized that this was no ordinary case. The missing computer tower was likely used to store surveillance footage, and clearly someone had deliberately destroyed the surveillance equipment to avoid being recorded. Initially, the police suspected that the couple might have had a big argument and left home, but the family members unanimously stated that the couple had been married for just half a year and had a very good relationship, making it impossible for such a violent quarrel to have occurred. Given that family discord was ruled out, the situation became much more serious. The police suspected that the couple might have been victims of a break-in, kidnapping, or even a murder motivated by personal grudges. Based on these hypotheses, the investigators further uncovered more clues. First, the wall surrounding the yard was only about the height of a single person, and an adult male could easily climb over it. Several climbing footprints were indeed found on the wall. Additionally, the anti-theft bars installed on the windows showed signs of having been pried open. Upon opening the wardrobe, several women's handbags were found with their linings turned inside out, showing clear signs of being rummaged through. All these clues pointed toward the possibility of a break-in. However, the truth of the matter seemed to be far more horrifying than a simple burglary. Under the light of the forensic investigation lamps, bloodstains that were invisible to the naked eyes became visible on the living room and bedroom floors. At the same time, the investigators noticed something strange about the bed in the master bedroom. At first glance, the bed appeared relatively neat, with nothing particularly unusual. But upon closer inspection, they found that the mattress was not covered with a bed sheet or bedspread, and only a quilt and 2 pillows were on it. In a normal household, no one would sleep directly on a mattress without putting a sheet on it first. So it was clear that something has happened on this bed. The investigators then lifted the quilt to check and found very obvious and fresh bloodstains on the mattress and one of the pillows. Next, the investigators discovered the wife's underwear and lingerie on the floor of the guest bedroom with visible signs of being violently torn. By this point, it was clear to everyone that this was no ordinary break-in. It was likely accompanied by severe violence and possibly sexual assault. There was one more crucial and perplexing discovery in the room. On the living room coffee table was a pile of messy bowls, chopsticks, and leftovers, with a particularly conspicuous pot of braised pork. There were also several beer bottles on the floor, as if someone had just had a big meal here. The problem, however, was that the husband didn't drink at all, and the couple didn't like eating meat, especially fatty dishes like braised pork. This led to the conclusion that the meal must have been made for someone else. Did someone visit their home last night? Could this guest have seen or known something? However, this so-called guest had carelessly thrown a leftover slice of watermelon and a cigarette butt, items that should have been disposed of in the trash, into the wardrobe. What kind of real guest would behave so rudely? From this, it was judged that this guest was very likely the suspect. While the investigators carefully examined the interior of the house, they also conducted a thorough search outside. Their top priority was to quickly find the whereabouts of the couple, whether they had been kidnapped or encountered some other accident. As long as they were safe, everything could be resolved. But a rational analysis suggested that most likely something had indeed happened to them. Because the couple lived in a very remote area, their house was the last one at the end of a small path. From the way it was decorated, it was clear that the entire row of houses was newly built, resulting in a low occupancy rate. Coincidentally, their only neighbor was also absent, and on the other side of their house was a vast forest and a river. This area was practically an ideal hideout for criminals. In such a sparsely populated environment, even a minor incident could go unnoticed, making their home an easy target for wrongdoers. Based on this reasoning, the investigators focused their search on the forest and the river, and their judgment turned out to be very accurate. They quickly recovered several brightly colored plastic bags from the river, which was scattered with various household trash. Among the garbage, they found a pair of the husband's trousers, their marriage certificate, and several of their bank cards. Clearly, these items had been discarded in the river by the criminals after cleaning up the crime scene in an attempt to cover their tracks. This also suggested that the criminals had indeed been near the area. As a result, the investigators intensified their search nearby and soon discovered a suspicious abandoned building about 200 meters from the riverbank. Although the building was dilapidated, it was still relatively enclosed, making it a perfect place for criminal activity. Sure enough, they found scattered bloodstains on one of the walls, and following the blood trail for about 100 meters, they came upon a massive cave. According to villagers, this cave had been naturally formed, and someone had once committed suicide there, which caused most people to avoid the cave. However, the investigators could see from a distance that there were piles of fresh corn stalks inside the cave. Who would place fresh corn stalks in a cave? cave where someone had died, especially when they were so recently placed. All these signs seemed very suspicious, so the investigators decided to investigate further. To their shock, as they approached the cave entrance, they saw bloodstains on the ground. Everyone's hearts immediately skipped a beat. With a mix of apprehension and determination, they carefully proceeded into the cave. The deeper they went, the more expansive the space became. When they finally pushed aside the corn stalks, they found two bodies lying there. These were the missing couple they had been desperately searching for. However, what shocked everyone wasn't just the fact that the couple had been murdered, but the horrific state of their bodies, which could only be described as unimaginably brutal and inhumane. The victims' bodies were covered with bruises from beating and binding, especially the wife, whose body was almost unrecognizable. Due to social considerations, the police kept the details of the autopsy report confidential. However, there were rumors circulating that the wife's pelvis shattered at the slightest touch from the coroner. If this rumor was true, it was unimaginable what kind of torture she must have endured before her death. After all, the pelvis is one of the hardest parts of the human body. Such a cruel and vicious crime was rare in the peaceful countryside, and the news of the young couple's murder spread like wildfire through the local community. Soon, a variety of bizarre and terrifying rumors circulated, some speculating it was a crime of passion, others suggesting it was an act of revenge. Theories abounded. To give the deceased's family closure and to calm the panic among the local residents, the police had to apprehend the killer as quickly as possible and solve the case. As mentioned earlier, the investigators had retrieved several of the victims' bank cards from the river, so it was highly likely that the killer had accessed the money in them. The police immediately began tracking the transaction records of the cards and soon discovered that on the night before the couple's disappearance, around 9 p.m., a young man had withdrawn 11,000 yuan from one of the cards. The surveillance footage showed the young man smiling in delight as he pocketed the money. If they could capture this individual, the case would be easily solved. Unfortunately, no one in the village recognized the young man, and the police were unable to track his movements after he left the bank. This important lead was forced to be abandoned. However, the police did not give up easily. They continued their investigations in the village, speaking to witnesses. Finally, their efforts paid off when a village reported seeing 4 unfamiliar men lingering around the abandoned building mentioned earlier for several hours, the day before the couple's disappearance. Among these 4 men, one was tall and heavy-set, while the other 3 were short and thin. None of them were locals, and no one in the village had ever seen them before. Another villager also came forward, stating that on the day the couple went missing, just before dawn, he vaguely saw 4 men hurriedly walking away from the couple's house, with one of them seemingly carrying a large box-like object. The officers immediately realized that the large box must have been the missing computer tower. With 2 villagers having spotted the same 4 men, the suspects were essentially narrowed down to these 4 individuals. The main issue now was how to quickly identify who they really were. Just when they were at a loss for what to do, a new lead came through. As part of their investigation into the bank cards recovered from the river, they found one card in the husband's pants pocket. However, this card did not belong to the couple. It belonged to an elderly man in his 60s who was frail and lived over 100 kilometers away in a different village. He was physically incapable of committing the crime, but his son, however, was a prime suspect. The son, 25 years old, was known to be lazy and unproductive, often squandering his father's pension after stealing the bank card. This man was also nicknamed Fat Brother because he was tall and heavy, which matched the description of the fat man among the 4 suspects. It was well known that Fat Brother had 3 close friends, who were the thin ones in the group of 4. These 4 men all had no regular jobs and spent their days wandering around, often engaging in petty criminal activities. The person caught on the bank surveillance camera withdrawing the money was the youngest among them, only 17 years old and still a minor. Up until this point, the identities of the 4 suspects were finally confirmed, but they had already fled. After a night-long pursuit, the police managed to capture all 4 of them on a bus. This was just 2 days after the crime. The 4 suspects couldn't believe how quickly they were caught. Upon investigation, it was revealed that aside from Fat Brother and the youngest minor who had no criminal records, the other 2 had previously served time for robbery. The question that lingered in everyone's minds was, why did they kill this newlywed couple so brutally? How did they commit the murder? At last, the answer came. According to the 4 killers' statements, none of them had any legitimate source of income, and they were all addicted to online gaming, often spending money to buy in-game credits. The minor in particular was desperate to buy a new iPhone which they couldn't afford. So the 4 of them decided to pull off a big heist. They started roaming between villages looking for a target and eventually set their sights on the couple's house. In fact, before the couple was killed, the 4 had already broken into their home once to steal, and it was during that break-in that they pried open the security window. However, that time they didn't manage to steal anything valuable. Instead, they were drawn to a wedding photo hanging on the wall. They found the wife in the photo to be extremely beautiful, which sparked a malicious thought. It was after that first burglary attempt that the couple installed security cameras on the wall of their yard. They believed the cameras would deter thieves, but little did they know they hadn't even had a chance to repair the pried open security window before a much greater disaster struck. Since the first failed burglary, the 4 men had been fixated on the beautiful wife in the wedding photo. While playing games in internet cafes, they would often joke with each other and fantasize about her. The more they fantasized, the more excited they became, and they decided to return to the couple's house to carry out a bigger crime. This time, they decided to rob the house and have their way with the wife. So, on the afternoon of May 14, 2013, around 2 p.m., they armed themselves with knives and handcuffs and set their plan into motion. They first hid in a nearby abandoned building to observe the house and wait for the right moment. While smoking and waiting, they saw villagers still coming and going around the area, so they decided to keep waiting. Finally, around 6 p.m., they saw the couple leave on their electric scooter. The 4 men then planned to climb over the wall and break into the house. But just as they were about to do so, they suddenly noticed 2 newly installed security cameras in the yard. Fat Brother volunteered to climb up first and cut the power cables to the cameras. After successfully entering the house, they immediately began rummaging through the rooms, looking for valuables. Fat Brother opened the computer in the bedroom and realized that the footage of him cutting the camera wires had been recorded. Not knowing how to delete the video, he decided that when they left the next day, they would take the entire computer tower with them. Next, the 4 men took some watermelon and ice cream from the fridge and sat on the bed in the bedroom, eating and waiting for the couple to return. Around 7 p.m., the couple returned home. The 4 assailants, each holding a knife, were hiding behind the door, ready to ambush them. The wife entered the house first, and one of the attackers rushed forward and knocked her to the ground. The wife was so frightened that she immediately collapsed, unable to resist. The remaining 3 assailants then worked together to subdue the husband. These 4 assailants were particularly skilled at exploiting human weaknesses. They separated the wife and husband. He was in the master bedroom and she was in the guest bedroom. The doors of the 2 bedrooms were opposite each other, so they could hear each other but couldn't see one another. Neither knew if the other was safe, so out of concern for each other's life, neither dared to act rashly, fearing that angering the attackers would result in harm to both of them. However, the attackers did not show mercy simply because they obeyed. On the contrary, they became even more cruel in their actions. The first to suffer was the young, beautiful wife. The 4 attackers subjected her to brutal and inhuman abuse. The details were so vicious and savage that the police deliberately concealed many parts of the story. Various rumors spread, some so perverse that even animals wouldn't behave in such a way. During the assault on the wife, Fat Brother changed into the husband's pants and, while doing so, slipped his father's bank card into the pocket of husband's pants. Later, when Fat Brother was cleaning up the crime scene, he accidentally got blood on the pants, so he switched back into his own clothes, forgetting to take the bank card with him. The card was discarded with the husband's pants and other garbage like beer bottles and thrown into the river. It was this small mistake by Fat Brother that later became the key to solving the case. Now imagine the husband's perspective, severely beaten and near death, covered in wounds. He sat on the bed in the master bedroom, listening to his wife's desperate screams. His heart must have been broken, but he was powerless to help. After the attackers had finished venting their brutal desires, the wife was barely alive. At that point, the attackers suddenly became hungry. They hadn't eaten all day, and since the husband worked at a night market food store, there were plenty of ingredients at home. They forced him to cook for them. The husband believed that if he complied and prepared a large meal to please them, they would release both him and his wife. However, he clearly underestimated the evil of these criminals. After eating and drinking their fill, the attackers became even more reckless, continuing to torment and beat both him and his wife. They then demanded the bank card information, forcing him to give them the account passwords and sent the minor one to withdraw money from the bank. Once they had the money, the attackers began discussing how to kill the couple to silence them. They knew how serious their crimes were, and if they left the couple alive, they would inevitably report them to the authorities. So they decided it would be better to kill them, as the dead do not speak. It is said that they killed the husband first. Before he died, he pleaded with them, saying, "Please, when you kill me, could you do it quietly? I'm afraid my wife will hear and be scared. She's always been very timid, and she's already 3 months pregnant." This poor newlywed couple, after enduring 8 hours of torture, did not live to see the morning light. To cover up their crimes, the 4 murderers quickly cleaned the room, throwing the trash and the computer tower into the river. As for how to deal with the bodies, they had previously come across a cave while wandering around the area. The cave was in a very concealed location, making it an ideal place to hide someone. So, under the cover of darkness, they carried the couple's bodies to the cave. Along the way, they stopped to rest in that abandoned building because they were exhausted, which is why bloodstains were found there. After placing the bodies in the cave, they somehow managed to steal a pile of corn stalks and covered the bodies with them. If it hadn't been for the sharp eye of the investigator, it would have been very difficult to discover that the bodies were hidden there. The brutal murder case caused a huge uproar in the local area. The public harbored an intense hatred for the 4 perpetrators. When the murderers were arrested, the villagers who had gathered around even tried to rush forward to beat them. However, justice was ultimately delivered through the law. In the end, the only minor among them was sentenced to life imprisonment, while the other 3 were all sentenced to death. Their sentences were officially carried out in 2016, 3 years after the incident. The minor who showed good behavior in prison had his life sentence reduced to fixed-term sentence of 22 years in 2019. This means that at the latest, he will be released by 2041 when he will still be only 45 years old. There is also a possibility that he may receive further sentence reductions, and it's not impossible for him to be released at the age of 30. What made this case particularly memorable, aside from the extreme cruelty of the perpetrators, was the deep love between the unfortunate couple, which moved many people. Some wondered if the husband had fought back, would they have had a chance to survive? The police once simulated dozens of possible scenarios, but in all cases, the outcome was the same: death. Apart from the disparity in physical strength, the key reason was that both the husband and wife chose to sacrifice themselves to save the other. They both, without communicating, decided to comply with the murderer's demands. The wife believed that if she offered her body and satisfied the murderers, they would spare their lives. The husband also believed that if he gave the murderers all their money and prepared a delicious meal for them, they would be spared. However, both of them were wrong. They underestimated the evil of the murderers, and even more so, they underestimated the terrifying nature of humanity. Well, that's the story for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.